Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to the fourth and final episode of the Siege of Vervunhive, a mini-series within the greater expanse of the Sabbat World's Crusade at this point, I do suppose. But whilst the Crusade at large is nowhere near reaching a conclusion, the war on Verghast is very much so approaching its crescendo, even as the Imperials are engaged in their own nonsense. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, for example, is attempting to intervene in Commissar Pius Cowell's prosecution of the Narmenian Armoured Forces commander, Grismond. He, of course, had been accused of first and foremost being in violation of his deployment orders, as he had elected to go off his predetermined route and crash through a whole heaping heck of a lot of prime industrial real estate. This offence in and of itself, of course, would be very unlikely to land Grismond in front of a shooting squad. But his subsequent reaction upon being halted, assaulting a Vervunhive primary commissariat officer, that would do the trick. Especially as Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt had also confirmed in front of both the other Imperial Guard commanders and House Command staff that any officer found to be in violation of the chain of command needed to be issued the most severe of censure. Whoopsie. The Colonel Commissar, of course, was not on board with this and had sought out legal experts within the Hive to confirm his own assertion that in matters of the Imperial Guard, the authority of Imperial Guard commissars would at all points trump those of local commissariat personnel. Thus, of course, no trial against Grismond could actually be set without his presence. Therefore, he had plenty of time. Except, of course, there technically was another Imperial Commissar on planet, Pius Cowell, the people's hero. And so Gaunt had to grab a hold of his legal expert and literally haul him down into the depths of the Hive itself, where the trial against Grismond was currently underway. A complicated situation, to put it mildly already. One to be yet further complicated by, as we talked about last time, every single loudspeaker in the city beginning to blare out at maximum volume Imperator Asphodel's name. You see, whilst both the Imperial commanders and Hive command had assumed that the second storm was just that, a major massed assault, and it would take the enemy time to organize for another one, well, it turns out that the second storm was essentially just a massive reconnaissance by fire, where the Verzoikans moved to see if they could secure any significant advantages before launching an all-out mass escalade upon the entirety of the wall, whilst also blanketing out the Defenders' Vox network. The Defenders' communication systems had, as we've addressed on multiple occasions, not really been particularly effective at the best of times. Now, however, it went from merely not very functional to absolutely and utterly paralyzed, leaving the high and mighty commanders in the central Hive deaf, dumb, blind, and, perhaps worst of all, mute. In order to attempt to assert some sort of control over the situation, Marshal Crow immediately departed the central spire to head towards Sondar Gate. Gate, where he hoped to take direct command of the defenders and begin to communicate his decisions to lead the defense of the Hive via runners, or whatever form of archaic communication system he could establish. There was still a hope that the hard lines running throughout the wall would be intact enough to relay messages to the various portions of the defenses, even though the sheer scale of the enemy's assault appeared to make defense frankly somewhat pointless. The Phanerozoicans were attacking all along the wall, in numbers rivaling those of the first storm, in terms of both armor and super heavies, though this time the enemy also brought another weapon to bear, a far more subtle one. Haas East Fortress had so far been the quietest part of the front line. It had seen some fighting, sure, but it had not been the focal point of major enemy action. This was about to change, however, as the fort commander looked out over the battlefield in the direction of Ontabi Gate, just in time to see the gate explode, and to then subsequently watch the curtain wall also begin to explode, sending pieces of debris the size of battle tanks flying outwards into the Hive, as the wall all the way between Ontabi Gate and 2 Haas East Fort began to collapse, even bringing down a substantial portion of the fortress itself. And most disturbingly of all, the explosions had not come from without, they had come from within. Phanerozoican infiltrators and commando parties had managed to make their way into the wall, into the gate, and plant countless explosive charges, all whilst presumably defeating the defenders who were unable to call for aid, either due to the suddenness and the ferociousness of the attack, or due yet again to the absolute paralyzation of the communication systems. It immediately became a question where these invaders had arrived from. It was later apparent that they had arrived through the massive promethium pipes that connected Vervunhive to Varnic Hive, the dead hive that had disappeared in a nuclear explosion. As we talked about previously, the moment this happened, of course, House Command ordered all connections to Varnic Hive severed and closed off with permacrete blockers. But there were those amongst the mercantile class of Vervunhive whom, upon seeing, of course, the massively inflated price of promethium, decided to keep the pump lines open, so as to fill their own promethium bunkers to overflowing. I'm sure the profit margin of all that free promethium must have been extraordinary, but all the profit in the world tends to be of very little use if there is nobody left alive to spend it. And it was looking highly questionable whether or not anyone in the Hive would survive the day, much less so the coming years. And incidentally, the merchant who was responsible for this egregious security breach was discovered after the war. Traces of him anyways. Suffice to say, he did not live to enjoy his ill-gotten gains. But the sabotage was already a fact, of course, and the Phanerozoican Third Storm was breaking against the curtain wall up and down the entirety of its length. In many areas, the defenders were already in danger of being overrun, or were still already overrun. It was no longer a question of if the enemy would breach the wall, but when and in what kind of numbers. Ironically, the area of the wall that was doing the best at the moment was the area where there was no wall, the enormous spoil heap known only as the Spoils, which ran out over and through the curtain walls, was actually doing a better job of preventing the enemy's infiltration than the surrounding strongpoints, due to the incredibly difficult and harsh nature of attempting to ascend the spoil heap, offering plentiful semi-natural challenges, and on top of that, of course, were the spoilers. Specially trained and equipped Vervunhive primary defenders whose duty it was to deny any and all infiltration of the city via the spoil heap. With their training and equipment, they were making the advance exceptionally difficult for the Pharazoikans, and with the support of further specialists from the Tarth first and only, most valuably scout snipers with high-powered long-last weapons, well, the spoil was looking like it might just be the last place to fall. Cold comfort for everybody else, of course, but hey, it was something, wasn't it? But the bad news were not done just yet. Just as Marshal Crow finally arrived at Sondar Gate, he heard a loud atmospheric pop and a crack high above as the towering shield generators, extending an umbrella of safety across the entire hive, shut down. And with them, of course, went the shield as well. It was not overloaded, it was not destroyed, it was actively disabled. The Pharazoican gunners, of course, accepted the invitation for exactly what it was, and redoubled their bombardment of the wall, the hive, and all transit routes leading out from the central hive, and all Imperial Guard marshalling yards as well. Exactly the same sort of pattern that they had laid down on the city in the early days of the war, when they were attempting to paralyze the defenders and destroy them in their barracks. Well, the Pharazoikans would get a second chance of doing just that, at an even more pivotal moment. Back then, the wall was still fully supplied, fully manned. Even without the forces of the Imperial Guard, there was a decent chance that the defenders might at the very least have survived the first storm and the initial escalades. But now, the wall had already seen off enemy attacks. It was dangerously undermanned. Forces had been pulled back to rest and reorganize, assuming that there would be no further mass assaults. Worse still, the wall had not yet been fully resupplied with guns and ammunition. The logistical system of the Hive was beyond overloaded. It wasn't merely just moving troops back and forth, a significant enough challenge for a Hive under siege, with only so many arteries capable of transporting the huge quantities of men, but it was materiel. The wall had taken a devastating pounding. Weapons would need to be unearthed from ancient arsenals. Cannons, las weapons, heavy bolters and autocannons all needed to be brought from central depots to the wall, where they could replace destroyed wall guns. Furthermore, additional repair kits to try and patch up the wall's insides and repair rents or beginning cracks was also required. All of this equipment and specialized gear would choke arterial roadways for hours. Next on the list of priorities were the actual ammunition for these weapons, high-explosive warheads, anti-tank grenades, power packs for las cannons, and the millions upon millions of rounds of autocannon and heavy bolter shells. Only after that again came the equipment and the supplies for the average Imperial Guardsman, charge packs for las guns, and rations. Many of the units currently fighting at the front line had virtually exhausted their existing supplies during the second storm, and due to other things having a higher priority, had largely been incapable of resupplying themselves. And now, both those supplies and any additional Imperial Guardsmen that could be scared up from their barracks and thrown towards the wall were being intercepted by a massive curtain wall of enemy high explosive shells, pelting transports with shrapnel and blowing gaping holes in the permacrete highways. You'd almost think that the Hive and its command would be accustomed to catastrophe by now. But, accustomed or not, some drastic measures needed to be taken quickly. First and foremost, the shield needed to be reactivated. Holding the curtain wall was, well, frankly pointless if there was no Hive left to actually defend. Marshal Crow briefly considered turning around and heading back up to the Hive, but seeing the inferno that was beginning to play out on the way there, he realized that without a wall, there also wouldn't be a Hive, and so he would stay. Instead, however, he would dispatch his adjutant, and he gave him his most prized possession, the power sword of Hieronymus Sondar, the current master's illustrious forebearer, and symbol of command of the Hive. He instructed his adjutant to keep the sword at least safe, and to pass it on to the next man in command of the Hive, which would in all likelihood be Vice Marshal Anko. Well, more on that in a moment or two, as the Marshal himself had no expectation of surviving the battle at Sondar Gate, and if by some miracle he did, well, he could always ask to have his sword back. But most importantly of all was that the adjutant was to immediately lead a contingent of bodyguards and whatever military personnel he could scrunch up within the Hive Spire itself up to Salvador Sontar's personal abode and take command of the shield, one way or another, as the damage was only growing every minute the shield was down. Already in the opening barrage, General Zank, leading a massed column of North Call armor moving to reinforce the defenses, was obliterated. The whole column plus its commander in mere moments. The armor was of course moving in march order, all of their hatches open and unbuttoned, and no more than a meter or two separated each tank as they made the most of the limited space on the highways. Once the shield failed without any forewarning, and the first shells began hammering down amongst them virtually seconds later, there was no time to react. The explosions alone were dangerous, the shrapnel too, but the overpressure of that many massive high-explosive grenades slamming down all around them would have killed or injured most of the crew of a tank. Then the other tanks would just be sitting there, hemmed in by the now uncrewed carcasses of armored vehicles in front of them and armored vehicles behind them as far as the eye could see. And sooner or later, with the sheer volume of incoming fire, there would be direct hits. Now, one HE shell impacting on a tank might not be enough to destroy it. It might not even be enough to kill the crew inside with modern defensive measures. But if the hatches are open... oh yes. And one shell is one shell. 2, 3, 4, etc. Yes. Even the mighty Lehman Russ will not survive that kind of a beating for very long. All of this was, of course, also more than apparent back at Hive Command. All strategic movement within the Hive had, in essence, been brought to a complete halt. The Hive had been paralyzed. Orders could not be given, instructions could not be issued, and data could not be gathered efficiently from the front line. The only thing that House Command knew was that the Hive was on its last leg. It was dying, and its defenders along with it, and there appeared to be very little anyone could do. The stress of that realization would test the toughest of individuals, and unfortunately, Vice Marshal Anko was not amongst the most resilient servants of the Golden Throne. And so, with a room full of people screaming at him for instructions, with a mass of icons on his planning table flashing at him either for orders or because they were about to be destroyed, Vice Marshal Anko did what seemed to him the most reasonable thing at the time. He unholstered his sidearm, executed his planning table, and then moved on to the House Command staff and personnel, catching as many of them as he could with rounds as they all thronged to get out the command center's single exit. Whether or not he was intending to save the last round for himself or not, we will never know, as shortly after he began his rampage, a missile slammed into House Command and blew it and everyone inside of it straight out of the side of the Hive. It was now truly every man for himself, as each Imperial Guard unit fought its own isolated war against the unending mass of Pharozoican invaders. All they could do was wage the war in front of them, and hope that other forces would do the same to their flanks and rear. One of the first positions to begin to falter was to be Sondar Gate. It had evidently been designated as a primary and major objective by the Pharozoican forces. Presumably, previous attempts upon the gates, which had been close to a success, had marked it out as relatively weak, particularly in comparison to its position of tremendous strategic import. The Hieronymo Sondar Gate was one of the single largest remaining ingress points into the city, and gave access to the Square of Marshals just beyond it, a massive open space where the Pharozoican forces could mass for offensives on the rest of the city. The seizure of Sondar Gate, therefore, was clearly a key objective of the invader. And to make sure that they could seize it this time, they deployed yet another innovative and weird piece of siege technology, another one of the Heritor's woe engines. A creature described as praying mantis in shape, a siege tower in essence, moved up to the gate, shrugging off the now rather desultory barrage that the wall guns could put up in an attempt to hinder its approach, whereupon its two offensive limbs, its praying mantis arms, slammed down onto the gate fortress, affixing the entire enormous machine firmly to the gate and its gate fortress, allowing Pharozoicans to stream up into the praying mantis and directly onto the battlements. Numbers, yet again, were the attackers' primary weapon, and they began to overwhelm the bastion. The Vervunhive primary troopers offered brave and stubborn resistance, but when Marshal Crow, who had been leading the defensive efforts, was swept from the top of the wall and sent flying down onto the rubble below, the defenders took a near-mortal blow to both morale and command structure. Miraculously, Marshal Crow actually survived the fall, although he was crippled in doing so. He lay there, body broken, far down below the battlements, and stared up as thousands of Pharozoican troops stormed into it and started torching it, clearing it room by room with explosives and flamers, until, at long last, the Marshal's life was ended by some random Pharozoican foot trooper, who probably had no idea that he'd just mercy killed the Supreme Commander of Vervunhive. But the Vervunhive planned to stream into the field of marshals, and then use it as an enormous, marshalling ground, to launch attacks upon the rest of the city, were frustrated by a formation of Tarth first and only troopers under the command of Sergeant Brin. Him and his men, some 300 soldiers in total, had been resting in billets in the Anko-chemical plants areas beyond the Square of Marshals. Once the shield faltered, however, Sergeant Brin acted quicker and smarter than most. Instead of waiting for any instructions, and none would ever come, he realized that he was sitting in an area that was prime billeting ground for troops that were in reserve to defend the wall defenders, and he also knew that the enemy would know that just as well as he did. Getting his men out of their bunks as swiftly as possible, he ordered them to move into the vast refuse and spoil heaps beyond his billeting locations. Enormous labyrinths of industrial waste, of refuse, of garbage. Virtually unmapped and uncharted even by the locals, the area had been used as a refugee ground of sort for those more unfortunate after the great escape from the outer Hive. Many who didn't have official citizenship or registration, or who were simply worried that they might be taken advantage of, either by the Vervunhive primary police forces, the commissariat, or their fellow refugees, had fled into this wild, untamed area where people could go to ground and remain hidden for very long indeed. It also proved to be an excellent defensive area, where Brin and his 300 managed to hold off a near regiment-strength force of Vervunhive. As the enemy's superiority in armor benefited them not at all in this rugged terrain, a mini spoil heap. Just like the wall was holding out so effectively, this also allowed the Tarth to play to their greatest strengths of concealment, hit-and-run tactics, and their efficiency as light infantry. Even when the Vervunhive managed to get lighter, smaller, more mobile and nimble vehicles into the area, they were easily outmaneuvered and destroyed by Tarth tank hunting teams using shoulder-mounted anti-tank launchers. This delay to the Vervunhive's ability to begin to pour into the Hive proper, and beginning to spread through it, would prove crucial later on. And the Tarth had other achievements that day as well. The force under the command of Major Rawn and a Volpen blue-bled Colonel, Corday, were holding Veve Gate against all comers, with the enemy's war machines having provided a better barricade than the Imperial Guard engineers could ever mount. The ruined and obstructed gate was now a perfect choke point and bottleneck. The Vervunhive could only funnel so many troops through it at a time, and as they began spreading into the area beyond and around the gate, they would be attacked by the Tarth, playing to their strengths as light infantry. They could launch blistering attacks upon the Vervunhive, causing far more casualties than their limited numbers and light equipment would suggest, before falling back as rapidly as they had arrived. And when the Vervunhive then moved to pursue what appeared to be a fleeing light enemy foe, the Tarth would run right on back into the Volpen Blue Bloods, who would then counterattack the pursuers, smashing them apart by playing to their strength as heavy infantry. It was remarkable, really. The Blue Bloods and the Tarth had no love for one another, and Colonel Corday himself, although he had put on an act of behaving cordially towards the Tarth, secretly despised them, and would happily sacrifice them if it meant he could spare his own Blue Bloods. But due to the ferocious necessity of simply just surviving through the day, the two forces melded together remarkably well, and managed to maintain resistance even when most of the other areas of the front line had already collapsed. In fact, 6 hours into the third storm, the primary threat to Major Ron's Tarth and Corday's Vulpen were not the enemy in front of them, but instead the Pharozoikans moving through Sondar Gate, who were now in a position to begin outflanking and cutting off the brave defenders of Vevere. Luckily for the defenders, Tarth reinforcements that had been hurrying on foot from their own billets under the command of the Tarth's second-in-command, Colonel Colm Corbeck, arrived just in time to interpose themselves between the Pharozoikans and the vulnerable flanks and rears of the Vevere defenders, who, due to again the complete collapse of communications, had no idea they were about to be encircled. But the truly decisive action of the third storm did not actually take place on the battlefield at all. Instead, it happened deep beneath the main Hive spire. As we mentioned a while ago, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt was heading down into the bowels of the spire to interrupt an official court-martial being held by Commissar Pius Cowell and the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat against General Grismond of the Narmenian Armor. He had with him an advocate and expert in Imperial law, and he was soon thereafter to be joined by the Vulpen General Noches Sturm, along with his bodyguard. You see, before leaving the spire, Marshal Crow had ordered Sturm to head down and get an end to the court-martial because, well, no matter how correct it might be, the Hive was on the edge of defeat, and it could not afford to waste one of its best armored commanders right now. Gaunt did not know about this until he saw Notcher, Sturm and his Blue Bloods joining him. He was skeptical at first, but Sturm reassured him that they had a shared purpose today. And he was fortunate that he arrived too, because Commissar Cowell was not about to hand over his authority over this court-martial. Apparently, the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat had not heard all of the nonsense going on outside, and the discussion grew rapidly more heated until the shooting started. And coming out on top, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt and his newfound Vulpen friends killed the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat officers and captured Commissar Pius Cowell, freeing General Grismond and ordering him immediately to ascend up the spire and take command over his armored regiments, who were apparently just standing idly by without their commander. What? Were they on some sort of protest or something? Ridiculous. Anywho, Cowell was brought along, as he was now going to be brought up on his own case of a court-martial for crime committed against Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, I suppose. Whom, to be fair, had more important things to worry about just then and there. He'd freed Grismond, but now he'd also been informed that the shields were down. Busy day for the Colonel Commissar, busy day indeed. He ordered Sturm to return to the command center, whilst he grabbed the Blue Blood bodyguards to lead them up Spire to find Salvador Sondar and inquire, rather pointedly, no doubt, as to why the shields were down. Upon arriving at Sondar's private quarters, they discovered the remnants of Marshal Crow's adjutant and his own bodyguard, who had attempted to break into Sondar's private abode and turn the shields back on. But they had been intercepted by his flesh puppets, whom he had now apparently armed. He'd also created quite the monstrous behemoth of various body parts that he'd sewn together for shits and giggles. This disgusting perversion of the human form killed several more of the bodyguards, both of the adjutant, who expired, and the Vulpen Blue Bloods. And it damn near killed Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt as well. You see, the thing had acid for blood. And so when the Colonel Commissar struck it with his beloved chainsword, a gift from his mentor Delane Oktar, he wounded the beast to be sure, but it also destroyed his primary weapon, and were about to destroy him as well, were it not for the actions of Commissar Pius Cowley, whom, after having been freed by Gaunt, understanding that, yep, we are going to need all hands on deck now, leapt onto the beast and shoved crack grenades down its throat. Not appreciating its new diet, it bit down, tearing both of the Commissar's arms off. But a few moments thereafter, the crack grenades detonated, blowing the creature to smithereens. And I would think killing everybody in the room, considering its acid-like blood, but miraculously, no one was apparently affected by that. Authorial forgetfulness aside, Commissar Pius Cowley died, with his rank pins attached after Gaunt returned them to him, recognizing the bravery of his sacrifice. A noble gesture on the Colonel Commissar's behalf, especially as Cowl had just enough life in him to spit out a little venom at the Colonel Commissar. Well-deserved venom, mind you, as he pointed out that Gaunt was too soft for this business. He wasn't too soft to execute Salvador Sondar, however, who had by now turned into a bloated, distended monstrosity hanging within his Vita chamber. He'd been ripening for quite some time. Sondar had apparently been corrupted via the communications channels open between him and Ferozoica Hive, where, of course, Heritor Asphodel had taken control quite some time ago. It is testament to the distance between the two that he had not grown corrupted quite enough to become a full-scale puppet of the Heritor. This might also shed some light as to why Varnic Hive disappeared so suddenly. It may be that Asphodel had been working his influence on quite a few High Masters all across the planet, and he had simply turned out to be more effective with the High Master of Varnic than of Vervunhive. With the High Master now dead, the shields could be reignited with the authorization that Marshal Crow's adjutant had brought with him. And as the shield bubble once again began to extend across the Hive, miraculously the Hive had not taken enough damage to seriously incapacitate it or destroy its pylons, thank the God Emperor. Strategic movement within the Hive was now finally possible again, and the bombardment of the Ferozoican artillery was stopped, allowing the Imperial Guard defenders, who had now been seriously exhausted, and in many cases pushed beyond the wall, to fight at least on an equal footing with the enemy attackers. Though, make no mistake, the situation was still desperate. The enemy had gained access to the Hive, and was streaming right past the curtain walls, as both Crow and Untabi gates also had to be surrendered to the enemy. Vervun primary forces were withdrawing in decent order, even if they had virtually no command and control capabilities left, supported primarily by the Rowan Deepers battalions, who were able to provide expert leaderships from their Imperial Guard officers. The two forces meshed reasonably well together, considering the circumstances, and the majority of the troops were able to extricate themselves without being annihilated. Crucially as well, Haas West Fort was still in the hands of the defenders. Some 5,000 Vervun primary troops were holding it and fighting bravely for every inch, even as tens of thousands of Ferozoicans launched themselves at it and began blowing holes in its defenders and infiltrating the insides of the fortress. This was a crucial linchpin in the Imperial defenses. If it fell, then the eastern side of the Hive would be laid bare, and enormous amounts of Imperial troops could be circumnavigated around the city landing fields, which would also give the Ferozoicans access to the main spine itself. Captain Kargin, the commander of Harswest Fort, knew this, and so inspired his men to fight on with remarkable determination and stubbornness. Though it might just be a question of time before they were overwhelmed, as supplies began to be a real problem yet again. In fact, it was the supply situation and its ever-worsening state that eventually forced Major Orn and Colonel Cordoy of the Volpin and the Tarth to withdraw from Veve Gate. They were able to receive at least some resupply from Colm Corbec's forces who had moved up to support them, but they too they'd been withdrawn to rest and reorganize themselves, and had only been able to grab whatever they could out the door, in essence, before rushing off to help their brethren. And whilst now that the enemy bombardment had at least ceased, you'd think that supplies could begin to flow again, but the roadways were still pockmarked with countless explosive craters. The roadways were hardly fitting to move much of anything, really, without significant effort. Worse still, the Ferozoicans had infiltrated past the Imperial Guard in many locations, as they were now in essence fighting a desperate, scattered guerrilla war against the invaders. There were entire battalions and companies of Ferozoicans that had simply moved through the gaps in the Imperial lines without even knowing that was what they were doing, making the transportation of supplies and reinforcements even more hazardous. Something remarkable needed to happen, and it needed to happen soon, and without central command and control, that was an impossibility. Fortunately, there was still one Imperial Guard commander in the main Hive spire, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt. He was now the Hive's ranking Imperial officer on station. You might be wondering what happened to General Notcher Sturm? Well, he'd figured the battle was pretty much lost, and had attempted to flee on a shuttle. Gaunt clapped him in irons, unsurprisingly. And as for General Grismond, well, within the Imperial Guard, armoured commanders are always subservient to Imperial Guard infantry commanders. It might just be one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, but details. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt was therefore the only man for the job, and more importantly, the only one in a position to actually seize the job. He was handed the power sword of Hieronymus Sondar by Marshal Crow's adjutant as a sign of the fact that he was now supreme commander of Vervunhive. Rushing to reorganize whatever he could of a command staff and getting communication system back up and running again, he slowly began to reassert central command and control over the scattered Imperial Guard forces, being forced to start from the very ground up by contacting individual commanders to figure out where the hell their troops are and what, if anything, was in front of them. One by one, he extended his situational awareness until he was able to mount an organized defense. Fortunately, again, with the shield overhead, the enemy's primary offensive advantage, their artillery, was neutralized, and their second offensive advantage, their armor, was severely hampered by the highly unfavorable environment it found itself in. It doesn't really matter how many tanks you have if every road is a narrow-ass street and all of the highways have already been blown up by your own artillery. You're not going to get very far without infantry support. And the infantry were getting absolutely slaughtered by dug-in defenders every inch they advanced. Ironically, the awful communication systems that had caused the defenders so much grief were now actually working to their advantage. Since all the defenders had no real idea what was going on, they were simply engaging whatever was in front of them. As they didn't know any better, they would simply dig in, resist, and only withdraw when absolutely forced to do so. And most crucially of all, General Noche Sturm, before attempting to escape, had also issued a general retreat order. A retreat to where? That's a very good question. As, of course, as we have seen many times, the only retreat path would be, the River Harse? An enormous, super-wide, rapid-flowing river with only a handful of connections and some ferries. Yeah. You weren't getting a whole lot of anything across there safely, especially not with the Pharozoikans closing in. But Noche Sturm was not exactly in his best mind at the moment. Indeed, when he was relieved of command and arrested for desertion, again, rightly so, he requested the honor of taking his own life. The Colonel Commissar decided to honor this request and handed him a loaded sidearm, which Notches immediately turned on the Commissar. Only Gaunt's distrust of the General and his own quick reaction, plus the keen edge of his newly found power sword, saved his life and severed the General's hand from his wrist. Well, that at least was one battle that Gaunt wouldn't have to fight again, as he refocused his efforts on, well, simply surviving the next few hours. In the center of the war front, Sergeant Bray, and anybody he could find, honestly, Vervunhive Primary, Imperial Guard, Rowan Deeper, Scratch Companies, civilians, whatever he could get his hands on, was slowly falling back towards the Hive's interior. Their main objective now was to dig down and protect the vital shield pylons. If those were captured or destroyed by the Pharozoikans, then that would truly be the end of it, as Pharozoikan artillery could yet again begin supporting their infantry and armor. Bray also had a far more squishy cargo to guard as well. Hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of civilians were now beginning to throng out of the workers' hives and into the main spine of the Spire and the Commercia districts. They were all attempting to get to the docks on the northern end of the city. They were hoping to be able to cross across the river either on ferries or via the road bridge or the viaduct channel and the railway connection, attempting to get to safety to the manufactorums on the other side. There were far too many people, again, for these limited points of egress to ever be able to evacuate them in time, but in times of tremendous distress, people tend to simply move and hope, rather than surrender to the inevitability of hopelessness. And there were bright points as well. The enormous tear in the curtain wall between Crow Gate and Ontabe Gate Fortress, which had been torn open by the Pharozoikan infiltrators, had been pouring armor en masse into the Hive. It had become the enemy's main entrance into the Hive proper. And it would be a wound that would continue to bleed unless something could plug it. But there were no Imperial Guard forces capable of engaging the enemy in what would in essence be an enormous, relatively open-pitched battle. Not, that is, until General Grismond and his Narmenian armor was on the field. Back under the command of their general, mounted in his personal battle tank, Grace of the Throne, the Narmenians led further north core elements and formed up the spearhead of the mechanized and armored counter-thrust. This finally allowed the Narmenian armor to really shine. as they engaged enemy armoured columns that outnumbered them many, many times over. The Armenians would send half of their forces barreling through the enemy columns, firing at max speed as they did so, as the Armenians valued their driver skills above anything else, trusting in their gunners' expertise and the excellent stabilization mechanisms on their tank guns to keep them on target. This first wave of Armenian armor would pass through the enemy column, causing chaos and distress before shooting out the other side. The enemy commander, now finally beginning to realize what was happening, would then turn his weapons against the force that were just leaving. At this point, the Leman Russers would turn around, and the second wave of Armenian armor would then begin their assault on the same side of the column that the Armenian armor had just passed through, catching the enemy column in a scissor between both forces of Armenian armor. This would of course also place the Armenian tanks themselves in one another's firing lines, but this was a well-trained elite regiment, and Grismond was rightfully proud of the fact that he had never once, whilst carrying out this maneuver, lost a single vehicle to friendly fire. Vervunhive would prove no different. And whilst the North Corps armor were engaging the enemy in a far more standard slugfest duel, the Armenians rushed up and down the enormous gaping hole in the Hive's flanks, destroying column after column after column, racking up a truly amazing kill count, and thus near single-handedly stopped the bleeding from the western side of the city and protected the millions of refugees flooding down towards the docks. So long as the Armenians had enough fuel, ammunition, and stamina, it looked like they would be able to keep this breach sealed. The Colonel Commissar in the main spire probably finally drew a breath of relief at this, as the front lines were beginning to slowly stabilize. Countless scratch companies, formed from various Hive workers, were joining up with the Vervunhive primary defenders. Some of the best ones had already made quite the name for themselves, like one encountered by Colonel Bulwar during fierce fighting. This scratch company was some 700 strong, a significant force even if it was made up of eager amateurs, armed with whatever they could get their hands on, from grenades to melter charges to mining tools like simple picks and close-range heap cutters. This scratch company was under the command of General Organ Sorek, who had fashioned himself his own rank pins, thank you very much. Upon meeting with Colonel Bulwar, however, he was instead issued with the brevet rank of sergeant, as there were frankly too many generals in the Hive, and most of them had proven not that useful, honestly. These various scratch companies were slowly but surely integrated into the overall plan and registered within the Hive, where the Colonel Commissar was desperately reinforcing, well, anything and everything with anything and everything. At this point, the primary reason why the Hive defenders were not overwhelmed was because the enemy had still not fully broken through the spoil, and those areas that they had seized, like Sondar Gate and Veve Gate, were, well, still bottlenecks. Veve Gate was massively obstructed. Sondar Gate had taken an absolute pounding itself, and it could even at the best of times only accommodate so many troops moving through it. And now that the breach between Crow and Ontabi Gate Fortress had also been largely plugged, the stream of enemy reinforcements was finally beginning to slow. Having established a relatively solid line of defense, the Colonel Commissar withdrew for the night to bang one of the local nobles. I'm not even joking. This actually led the Colonel Commissar to being asleep when the single most important change in the battlefront occurred. You see, the garrison at Haas West Fort was still, remarkably enough, continuing to resist. It maintained the flank of the Imperial Guard positions and played a pivotal part in why the Imperial Guard defenders were still around at all. But its garrison had been severely reduced. Captain Kargin, the fortress commander, now had no more than 600 men left, most of whom were armed with nothing more than their personal sidearms or lasguns. All of the fort's artillery guns had either been destroyed or ran out of ammunition, as had practically all of its heavy weaponry. The men that were left now were, well, more of a hindrance than a true danger to the onrushing attackers, plinking away at them from firing slits. The captain ascended to one of the highest points in the fort to get a decent view of what was out there in front of him, and to communicate his situation probably one last time to Spire Command. That is when he saw a behemoth vehicle out in no man's land, a vast pyramid-like construct apparently grinding slowly towards the fortress on dozens of enormously wide caterpillar tracks. And couched in the middle of this vast spike was a cannon the size of his entire fortress. He hurriedly reported whatever he could to Spire Command, namely that there was something out there, it was really goddamn large, and he could hold out at best for another hour. That was spoken about 30 seconds before Haas West Fortress was simply wiped off the map as a goddamn naval weapon fired upon Haas West Fortress. Somehow, Heretor Asphodel had managed to not only scavenge a lance battery cannon, but had brought it down to the surface of the planet and built an armored casing around it. A casing capable of moving, albeit tortuously slowly. This thing was dubbed simply the Spike by what remained of Spire Command, and Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, after being roused from his carnal indulgences, was informed of the destruction of Haas West Fort and the approach of what must be the enemy command center, not only because of its sheer ridiculous size, but also because it was the central point of all of the enemy's communications efforts, including their attempt at jamming Imperial Guard communications by constantly spewing forth the name Heretor Asphodel. The Colonel Commissar was also informed that the Hive was now completely surrounded, as those poor unfortunate civilians that had managed to evacuate to the northern shore and the manufactorums, well, they were even now being slaughtered by Ferozoican mechanized forces that were rushing up the northern shores. There would be no escape from Vervunhive, and the railway bridge, the viaduct, and any connection to the northern shore were either being destroyed by the Ferozoicans themselves in their retarded eagerness to get to the Hive, or blown up by the defenders so as to not allow mechanized spearheads to stab them in the back. But despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation, the Colonel Commissar had a plan. You see, his coital activities had gained him more than a mild risk at STDs. He'd also been granted a secret weapon by House Crow's young and voluptuous heiress. Apparently, the house had kept a rather devious little secret in its vaults, a piece of archaeotech, a system slayer. In essence, a hyper-powerful virus on a USB stick, or the 40k equivalent. It had been crafted in case the Hive itself ever fell to tyranny, a tyranny as defined by whomever held the key, I'm sure, and would be used against the Hive to take care of aforementioned tyrant. But being a piece of archaeotech, the thing was unimaginably powerful. It could probably hack into and destroy virtually any system it could interface with, and, well, the enemy's central command and coordination system, along with their by far greatest weapon, was right now standing on the rubbled edges of the eastern side of the Hive, blaring out its commander's name. It doesn't take a genius to see what the next step in this saga should be. Although, getting there and actually carrying it out would still be quite the challenge. And so, Operation Hieronimo was created, after the Hive's original savior. It would call for a small, highly elite unit to infiltrate towards the spike, then get inside of it and introduce the System Slayer to its own internal workings, which would hopefully bring it and all of the Pharazoican command and control systems to a complete stop. Hopefully, it might even spread to their other pieces of war gear. Best case scenario, it would completely cripple the enemy, and even in the worst case, merely taking out the enemy's supreme command might just buy the Hive enough time for the War Master's reinforcements to arrive. It was a daring mission and a last chancer style operation that would be conducted by the cream of the crop of the Tarth Regiment alongside specialists from the Volpin Blue Bloods under the command of Colonel Gilbert himself. The two regiments sure have come quite the way from enmity to combined operations. This crack troop would further be led in by Scratch Company specialists who had experience operating behind the Pharazoican lines. This would obviously be made up of their best specialist individuals as well, under the command of their hero, Gol Collier. His story too is both a long, complex, and tragic one. On more than one level, mind you. But we will get to that much later, as his wife was killed during the opening barrage of the war, and he believed that his two children that were with her at the time, Darlin and Yonsi, had also died with their mother. However, they had in reality been picked up by a young Hive ganger girl, of all people, by the name of Tuna Creed. She had decided to bring the children from the bombed-out transit hub where their mother had died, and to protect them. She managed to get them into the Hive and near the Anko chemical plant, where they were hiding in the slag heaps along with many other refugees. She'd even broken into the Tarnith's first and only billets to steal supplies, where she was almost killed by Trooper Durman Caffron. But Tona had the high fortune of being attractive. Which meant that Caffron, instead of shooting her, instead sought her out later on to feed her and her two charges. And all four of them would in the end survive the siege. But we're wandering somewhat off topic here. Our little crack team began their journey towards the Great Spike surprisingly easily. Apparently, the Pharazoicans didn't think that anyone would be dumb enough to approach their spike, and so the Tarniths began climbing up the side of it. Which I feel like would have left them remarkably exposed and easy to detect by any sort of surveillance system or even accompanying troops, but details. Finding no ingress point, however, the Tarth began to wonder how they were to get inside, when the Blue Blood Colonel suggested that maybe they just march down the main weapons barrel. It was certainly large enough. And hey, if it fired whilst they were inside, they'd never know about it. As fine a plan as any suggested at the time, and so it was hastily and eagerly adopted. Fortunately for our heroes, the enormous naval weapon could not be fired continuously, and had a nice long cooldown period before the devastating beam could yet again lash out from the construct to cut deep into Vervunhive. The infiltrators ran into resistance quite early on, but clearly the Pharozoikans had not imagined that anyone would ever be so silly as to not only climb onto their ginormous weapon spike, but then infiltrate down its primary weapon either. And so the crack team made it to the command bridge relatively unscathed. And most crucially, with the system destroyer intact as well. The moment it was allowed to interface with the spike was in essence the moment when the Pharozoikan army ceased to be an army and became an armed rabble. And not a second too early either. The Narmenian armor that had been staunching the bleed on the western side of Vervunhive, between Ontabe Gate and Crow Gate, were just about overwhelmed. They had destroyed hundreds upon hundreds of enemy armor pieces, but flat crabs and further woe machines were driving them deeper and deeper into a corner, pushing them up until the edges of the Commercia, where all the civilians were sheltering. The shield pylons were now under direct attack from hordes of Pharozoikans, which were pouring through the Tarth and the Vervunhive primary defense lines just outside of it. The worker habs were, for all intents and purposes, fully conquered. Even the main spine was in the process of being infiltrated then and there, and the civilians, huddled together in the Commercia, could hear small arms fire now. Even as the Pharozoikan mechanized forces on the northern side of the river, no doubt were getting ready to start building pontoon bridges or sending across amphibious vehicles to slaughter the survivors. But all was not won just yet, as whilst the command bridge itself was surprisingly barren, there was a large chamber in the center. A chamber that now began opening, revealing the colossal form of Assassinating Asphodel in his full armor set. He killed 2 infiltrators in as many seconds, and would no doubt have gone on to slaughter the entire infiltration party, were it not for the fact that Assassinating Asphodel was surprised by this, as everybody else was. He began attacking his assailants immediately, but he clearly had not had enough time to fully analyze the situation, and so when he turned his enormous bolt pistol upon the Imperial Guard commissar rushing towards him, he failed to notice quickly enough that he was not wielding some chain sword, but a master-crafted power sword, which pierced straight through Heritor's armor and speared through his heart just as his finger twitched on the trigger, sending an enormous explosive bolt straight into the commissar's heart as well. The two would have died there together right then and there, had it not been for a exquisitely crafted metal rose that the Colonel Commissar had been gifted by the nobles of House Crow, who apparently grew gardens of metallic flowers. And I think the descendants of House Crow should give thanks every day to the God Emperor that aforementioned garden was destroyed in the battle. Otherwise, they would have wished they had perished with their hive. Anywho, the metal rose deflected and stopped the bolt shell enough to allow the commissar's beaten, bruised, bloodied, and unconscious form to be carried from the command spike and to safety. A miracle in and of itself. And another was playing out in Vervunhive. Without the constant chatter of the spike to keep all of the Chaos forces organized, they broke down completely. Many of the Verzoikens not only lost the will to fight, some even lost the will to live, wandering onto the enemy's guns or simply ending their own existences. Others appeared to have been under some sort of spell, and now released attempted to return back to Verzoika. Yet others still went to ground to offer ferocious resistance against the defenders who needed to winkle them out of their hidey holes weeks and weeks later. But all organized offensive actions were simply impossible for the Verzoikens. The Armenian armor was able to rally, drive off the flat crabs that now seemed incapable of mounting real resistance, and the infantry too shattered and scattered away from the defenders. It would be quite some time before the Imperial defenders were truly ready to take up an active pursuit, but once they were, they did so with a vengeance. Any and all means of transportation were acquired and used as troop carriers to launch Imperial Guard and Vervunhive primary forces out beyond the city and into the grasslands to hunt down the Verzoikens. By the time the Imperial reinforcements arrived some 12-odd days later, the battle had already been over for the majority of that time. Nevertheless, the War Master unleashed 6 million guardsmen on the world below, plus forces from 3 Astartes chapter, because Verzoika could not be allowed to continue to exist. The taint that had entered that now condemned hive had to be stamped out with absolute merciless prejudice. And it was. The hive itself being destroyed by point-blank range low-orbit bombardment. But it was not to be the only hive destroyed. Vervunhive too was, for all intents and purposes, shattered. The casualties were such that it would be impossible to restore the hive to functioning order, and even keeping it livable would be far more trouble than it was truly worth. The hive's population would be scattered out to the northern colonies and the other hives. 2 new hives would eventually be founded, but it would take centuries, millennia, before they would even become to rival the shadow of Vervunhive. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was a victory, and life, no matter how dark and harsh, is still life. Though many of the survivors wondered what they had to live for. Makaroth issued a decree stating that any surviving Vervunhivers who wished to do so could join up with the Imperial Guard, and many did so, especially the Tarth First and Only, the heroic regiment that had saved their hive, such as it was. And Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt became the new People's Hero. A more permanent one this time, as Commissar Pius Cowl, although his name would be remembered with due honor, had a somewhat complicated legacy attached to it now. Thus, the Tarth First and Only would leave the world of Verghast stronger than they had found it, And that was a good thing, as they too had suffered serious casualties during the siege. And with the new reinforcements, they were finally brought up to their old strength again, though a lot of adjustments were going to be needed. The Tarth first and only had been just that, the Tarth first and only. But now they were a mixed regiment, with people of a completely different culture living and fighting alongside them. They needed to adopt new officers, and weirdest of all, the Tarth first and only would now become a mixed regiment, as many of the survivors from the scratch companies who had fought alongside the Vervunhive primary defenders were women. Now this has obvious complications, and indeed, disciplinary action would grow ever more necessary shortly after the merger, because whilst a woman with an assault rifle can kill a man just as easily as a man with an assault rifle can, the moment you introduce a stock of females to several thousand men who haven't seen one in months, stowed together on troop transport ships, well, I hardly need elaborate, do I? There were also some more almost consequences of the siege as well. One of which, for example, were cries heard amongst some of the upper echelons of Imperial Command to reward Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's inspired defense of Vervunhive with a command position in the Imperial Guard. And hey, he had certainly demonstrated an aptitude for the position. Very few commanders could have pulled the defenses together as rapidly and as effectively as the Colonel Commissar did. However, there were a tremendous number of complications with such requests and voices. First and foremost, the simple fact that the current War Master, of course, was not exactly stable in his position. Makaroth was already viewed as an upstart, and as someone who didn't really belong in or deserve the elevated position that he was currently occupying. And now there were those who called for another, younger upstart, one of Slado's old favorites, to be elevated into a position where he might conceivably begin competing with the War Master for favor. Again, I hardly need elaborate on why the War Master was probably hesitant to adopt such a well-meaning idea, forwarded primarily by his detractors, I'm sure. Nor was it particularly difficult to find good reasons to deny this sudden and exceptional elevation either. Most obviously of all, of course, the Colonel Commissar had no actual experience with warfare on this scale, and he was fighting against, mere chaos zealots, and he was losing as well. Sure, he'd pulled off a Hail Mary victory in the end, but that was less due to strategic brilliance and more due to, well, a MacGuffin handed to him at the 11th hour. And that was hardly the only thing. He'd also involved himself romantically with a local noble. A very big no-no for the Imperial Guard due to the complications that will near inevitably ensue from such a thing, even though that was kept a secret, I assure you. The War Master's Intelligence Division and the Inquisitions is more than capable of unveiling such silly little secrets. Not to mention, it wasn't going to be a particularly well-guarded secret for long, either. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt had also facilitated a major rift between the local PDF forces and the Imperial Guard. A rift that saw not only the execution of a major PDF officer for a paltry offense in his first engagement, but also saw the near execution of a ranking Imperial Guard officer by Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's own goddamn testimony about the sacrosanct chain of command. Well, only sacrosanct so long as it favors the Imperial Guard, that is. Considering, as we've talked about on numerous occasions up until this point, that the position of High Commander in the Imperial Guard is as much a political one as it is a military one, yeah. For all his achievements, the Colonel Commissar was not ready for such a sudden elevation. The charitable interpretation, then, is that the War Master recognized this fact and decided to not elevate the Colonel just yet. The less charitable one would be that he recognized an obvious rival riding high on the back of a highly improbable victory and decided that this was not a very good time in the Crusade to encourage rivals. And to be fair, he was very much so right, as Heretor Asphodel's sudden return and very nearly successful counter-offensive had demonstrated to the War Master and the Crusade that its overextended frontage was far more vulnerable than they had dared fear. Regardless of the decisions made at such an elevated level, the Colonel Commissar was no doubt just really happy to still be alive, even though he'd be feeling that bruise for quite some time, and he was going to be kept plenty busy hereon trying to make sure that his new regiment wasn't going to tear itself apart. But that will be a tale for another time. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.